Welcome to Dune Chapter by Chapter. I'm Dominic, and this is going to be the discussion video for Chapter 7. So this was a pretty lengthy chapter, and this one actually took me quite a while to record this one. There was a lot of crazy words in this chapter and weird terminology that I had to look up and try to figure out best way to how to pronounce it. So it was a struggle to get through this record that last chapter. So anyway, now right off the bat, I want to talk about this is something I was going to mention in the last video, but I really couldn't talk about it until I had done this chapter. And so the last chapter where we left, the last chapter that I read before this one was Paul and his father together, ending with them talking about the Guild Highliner and that they were leaving the next day. Now, what I find interesting about Frank Herbert is now in this chapter, we're on Arrakis. The chapter starts off, they're on Arrakis, they're unpacking everything. Now, what I find interesting about this kind of like shows a little bit about how Frank Herbert views science fiction or how he goes about his science fiction writing. Because now, if this book were written by more modern writers, I guess, or like a lot of writers now, they want to describe everything and show everything. So there would have been probably a chapter devoted to them actually boarding the Guild Highliner. What's interesting about Frank Herbert, and I kind of noticed this, I never really noticed this the first time I read Dune, but I've noticed it more probably like the second or third time I read the book. That there's certain events in this book that you just assume are in the book, but he actually just like skips over it. So you'll notice that a few times in this book. And this is one of the things. Them actually getting on board the Guild Highliner and the Highliner actually folding space. That's not even like described or mentioned or anything. It's just they're on Caladan. They're talking about we're going to go on the Guild Highliner tomorrow. And they just, all the description you get of a Guild Highliner, it's a really big ship. That's it. And all of our ships can fit in one small little corner of it. That's all the description he says. Nothing else. And then, you know that you get no description of the Space Guild navigators. It's just told that no one knows what they look like. And then there is no chapter devoted to the actual folding of space. So there's no description of how they do it or what's the process. Nothing like that. It's just now we're on Arrakis. So he completely skips over. If that was written today, I wonder if another writer would have devoted a chapter to that, to explaining how that process works, how they use their prescience, and how the Holtzman engines work and all that kind of stuff, and describe that in more detail. You can tell Frank Herbert, he's not concerned with like the technology so much. He's not concerned with that kind of thing. He's like, his thing, he's concerned with like getting in like that interplay between characters. You know, that verbal dueling. That's what he seems to really like in that. And so I found that kind of interesting when I read it the second time around, or the second or third time I read Dune, where I kind of clued in, because you kind of take that for granted. Because if you watch like the David Lynch movie and you watch the miniseries, they always show the Guild Highliner. Like they devote a scene to that, showing that big Guild ship Highliner just fading away or folding space or wherever how it does it, and then showing up on Arrakis. But in the book, it just jumps right to the next chapter. You're on Arrakis. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. I thought was interesting. So now, this is the very first scene in the book that's set on Arrakis. So now we're on Arrakis in this chapter. And now you kind of get a sense of, you know, how they describe the planet, and you're starting to get a sense of how desolate it can be and how oppressive it can be because of the shortages of water and stuff. And now they're in the city of Arrakis and not the major city. It's a small garrison town because it's easier to defend and stuff like that. And so now we get the first interaction in the book between Lady Jessica and Duke Leto. And this is probably the first chapter that Paul's not in, as far as that goes as well. So they're talking about Jessica's very hesitant about this whole idea of being on Arrakis. And then, then there's that example of how she didn't want to put the bull's head or the painting in the dining hall. He insisted on it. And then she figured, well, I could always use my Bene Gesserit ways to manipulate him to get my way. Then she decides, no, I'm not going to do that. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. She and that kind of goes more into that in the next chapter. That there's a reason why she doesn't just want to manipulate everyone around her, even though she has that ability because she's a Bene Gesserit. But she's still very hesitant about the whole idea of being on Arrakis and knowing that it's a trap. She can just feel like the doom in the air. And so the other thing about this chapter is we get to meet our first Fremen, and that's the Shadout Mapes. So we get to meet her in this book, and then they describe her, and then it kind of describes more how the inhabitants of Fremen look. They're all very, it's like really, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like gaunt or emaciated or whatever, or desecrated. Like they look so dried up there because they're not overweight. They have no, they're all thin and all almost look undernourished just because of the environment they live in. Like they're always deprived, or they're always deprived of water, or they're always chronically dehydrated looking. And then we get a description of the eyes, blue within blue with no whites, which is something that I'm really curious how they're going to do that. Blue within blue. Now, in the David Lynch, they kind of had like an optical thing. For me, that didn't really work very well. That's one of the negatives of the David Lynch film, is they didn't do a good job with the Fremen eyes, or when the eyes get saturated with spice, as the way it's described in the book. I actually prefer one of the things about the miniseries that I prefer over David Lynch is how they did the eyes for the Fremen in that one. I thought it was really cool. They had a really neat trick for doing that. They just put in the lenses, but they were like almost like they were glowing lenses, so you just had to get a dark light on the actor's face, and those eyes, their contacts would glow like that bright blue, and so it would give that blue within blue look. So that was a neat thing. So in the book, I don't know how it's going to look in the movie. So in the book, it's described now. Do the Fremen's, is it a dark blue or a medium blue, or do the Fremen's eyes almost look like they're just black pits? That's something that I always kind of wondered it. So I don't picture them exactly like looking like black pits, but I kind of picture them more like at least the same shade of blue. So, but I'm more of a lighter blue. That's how I picture it in my mind anyway. And then we get to see a Chris knife in this also. We get introduced to that, and it's described as almost like emanating its own light. It almost has a glow, and that emanates inside of it because the way it is. Then you get a sparkle, and then no one can take the knife off of the planet, and if it's away from your body for too long, it starts to disintegrate. And anyone who haven't been cleansed, they see that knife, you have to kill them. So it's interesting. And then you can't put the knife away until you've drawn some blood. That's one of the things that really fascinated me about Dune. It's like it's a science fiction, but there's a lot of like hand-to-hand combat and close quarters fighting in the book with knives and stabbing weapons and stuff. I always thought that was really neat. I always liked that, emphasis on fighting with knives. It's one of the cool things about Dune that I always liked, is the knife fighting in the story, because usually other science fictions, they always go more with swords and stuff, or lightsabers and stuff, that instead of knives. So so we get introduced to the first one of that. So now, one thing I wanted to talk about is how the Bene Gesserit are like these grand manipulators, because right away, the first Fremen that Jessica meets, the Shadout Mapes, Jessica figures out she has a knife on her in her bodice, and so she wants to find everything she can about this Fremen, and so as she's going along, she figures out how to manipulate the Fremen. She figures out how to manipulate this particular Fremen into believing that she is part of a prophecy that was implanted into Fremen culture thousands of years before by the Missionaria Protectiva. And now she's in the position, and it was done That's the really interesting about the Bene Gesserit, is they really think long term, you know? So they planted that there for the day that a Bene Gesserit could come along and take advantage of it. And so Lady Jessica did. So now she's convinced this Fremen that she is part of this prophecy. And she will be the one, the great River Mother that's going to come and help save the Fremen. So that's really interesting. And then just goes to show that the Bene Gesserit are like absolute master bullshitters. Like they can bullshit their way in and out of anything because of their training. Like bullshitters on a cosmic scale. Like because of their training, they can observe, you know, all these little minute details that goes on with a person, every little twitch, everything that, you know, would give you away. And what's interesting, just goes on to further illustrate how religion is used as a form of social engineering. So they want to, you know, manipulate people to think their way or take advantage of them. They use religion. And that's the thing about the Bene Gesserit. They use religion as a tool to manipulate others. And, you know, that's certainly something that goes on within the real world. And there's all kinds of religions. And I'm not just talking spiritual religions, but especially today you see it, there's almost like political religions that you can't, if you're part of that religion, you've got to go along with the crowd. You can't, if you deviate or disagree or like cast it out. And, you know, that they, even though there's no God, they don't worship a God. They don't worship anything spiritual. It's not centered around anything spiritual, but it still has all the same trappings of a religion. Or like any kind of cult mentality. There's like purity tests and that kind of thing like that. And for me, it's kind of like a personal thing, because I was actually part of a very hardcore Baptist church when I was younger. And so a lot of the stuff that went on in that church, some of the same tactics I see go on with like other groups that you see like online, or, you know, political groups, especially now online, because everyone's so active online, you can see it more than you could years before. And how these ideologies, because that's basically all a religion is. It's an ideology. It's a collection of ideas that a certain group of, like a collection of ideas that, you know, a certain group of people share, and how those ideologies can be used to like basically do a lot of social engineering. So that's, you know, what the Fremen are, or that's what the Bene Gesserit, the two things they engage in is eugenics and social engineering. And, you know, and it's all for selfish means. Like they want, it's just so they can control everything. And then, because, you know, it's the Bene Gesserit, they're like everywhere throughout the empire. Like, you know, the emperor's married to one. Dr. Yui's wife was one. Most of the great houses, their wives are Bene Gesserit. So all the Bene Gesserit, they're all linked together. They all communicate. They're all in on the one plan. So they're, you know, they do a lot in. They're very a crucial element in the whole how everything goes on in Dune, with all the politics and the religion, and they're masters of it, of you know, social engineering and eugenics, and that's, you know, two of the big themes in this book. And then we get to see them work, you know, firsthand here, how they use the religion to, now she basically used the religion to gain the trust of this Fremen, because they want to gain this alliance, and like Leto said in the last chapter, so they can exploit the Fremen, basically. Now, obviously, the way the Atreides would exploit them is a lot better than what the Harkonnens would have done, but still it's exploitation nonetheless, which is interesting. And that's the thing about Dune. It's not like Star Wars. There's no clear-cut good guys and bad guys. It's a lot of gray areas. And so it's a lot more like real life. So that's interesting. You know, and that's the thing about Dune, and another science fiction book that really deals with this is having these super long-term plans that are stretched out over thousands of years. Like the Bene Gesserit really take their time to let their plans unfold literally over thousands of years of social engineering and eugenics. And another book that deals with that is the Foundation trilogy. That's why I really like that book as well, because Harry Seldon, his plan to save humanity or shorten the duration of misery when the empire of humanity eventually collapses. And this is a plan that's going to be stretched out way beyond his actual lifespan, which I don't know, just gives the story such a huge, broad appeal to it, or gives it such a great epic scope, I guess, that these books, and they really tackle with these really big issues. So I guess I'll wrap it up there. So that's everything I got to say in this video. Let me know what you think in the comments section, and I will see you at the next one.